Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Mike and I've been talking about my experience of taking part in National Novel Writing Month. I've just completed my 4th NaNoWriMo, writing the first draft of Untitled Fantasy Series Book 4. I'll come up with a proper name for these things eventually, in November 2022. In my previous video I talked about what it was like to take on the NaNoWriMo challenge and shared some general tips for beating it. If you want to watch, the link is in the description and on screen now. But did I actually learn anything useful from the challenge? Has it had any effect on any of my other writing projects? In this video I will attempt to answer those questions by looking at examples of the things I realised I was struggling with and the changes I decided to make to my writing habits. Again, I'm talking mainly about my own personal experience, and this is mainly stuff that applies to writing the first draft of a story, but that's often the trickiest part, especially for new writers, and hopefully there's something in all this that you will find useful. And so, without further ado, lesson number 1. Don't get distracted. It is so easy to become distracted when writing. When I do sit down to write, I close all other applications, put my phone out of reach, and put on some nice, chilled instrumental music. But those aren't the only kinds of distraction. Basically, I'm talking about, well, pretty much anything that doesn't involve actually putting words onto the page. Now, I should say that doing proper research, planning your story, and carefully crafting your prose are, of course, important, but they can also be obstacles that prevent you from getting to the end of that first draft. I'm particularly bad at this, which is probably why I never finished any of my previous attempts at writing novels, but completing NaNoWriMo helped me to realise what I was doing wrong and to find ways to avoid the things that kept me from seeing any of my novels through to completion. Let's have a look at some examples of the sorts of things I'm talking about. Character introductions are one thing that would always trip me up. Whenever I'd introduce a new character, I'd want to make them as interesting as possible, to make the audience immediately like them or fear them. Basically, I'd want the introduction to be perfect. I used to spend ages googling common names in various countries or using online name generators looking for the perfect name for a character. And suddenly, an hour had passed and I hadn't actually written anything. Looking back, this sort of thing happened to me a lot, and it can be especially wasteful when you come up with an idea for a really cool character and then realise that they don't actually fit into the story and you end up having to throw them away. When I was introducing characters during NaNoWriMo, I just used the first name that popped into my head. Hell, one of the characters in the Untitled Fantasy series doesn't even have a full name and is just referred to as Tyler. There are even a few places where other characters address him as, "Hey, first name Tyler," like a robot whose registration form hasn't been filled out. Now obviously this is not great writing, and it is something that I will have to go back and fix eventually, but thanks to the wonders of word processors, it is something that is easy to fix with a find and replace later on once I've settled on the perfect name. The other thing I came to realise, of course, is that ultimately the name of a character doesn't really matter to the story, especially when it comes to that first draft. Similarly, my story features some magical objects made of metal and crystal that are used to store memories. These objects are not unlike the holocrons from the Star Wars universe, and when I first introduced them I just couldn't come up with a good name for them, so instead of scouring the internet looking for inspiration, I just called them holocrons and decided to come back and rename them later. They're actually still called holocrons in the latest draft of the story, but don't tell Disney. This allowed me to just keep writing, while making it easy to remember what the objects were and what role they were supposed to play in the story. And that, I think, is one of the most important things I learned. There are some things you don't have to get right first time and you can always just come back and do them later. Naming people, places and things is something you will obviously have to do. You can't just plagiarise Star Wars unless you want the mouse's lawyers coming after you. But remember that only you will see that first draft, and the most important thing is to get to the end of the story. Only then will you truly understand what it is about, only then can you go back and begin the editing process. I quoted Sir Terry Pratchett in the last video, so this time I will quote the storytelling masters at Pixar. One of their 22 rules for storytelling is number 11, putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, a perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone. What you write will be flawed. No one writes a perfect story first time. It's only by getting the story out of your head and onto the page that you can begin to identify the problems and start to fix them. Lesson number 2, just pick something. While we're on the subject of the 22 rules, the very next rule on the list is number 12, discount the first thing that comes into your head, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, get the obvious out of the way, surprise yourself. Now, obviously I don't disagree with the wisdom of Pixar, but I have found myself agonising about how the next part of my story is going to play out. Sometimes you might want to avoid doing something because it's cliché or obvious. I have a separate rant about people's irrational aversion to clichés, but that's not the point of this video. The thing is, I often find myself becoming so obsessed with working out the perfect way to move the story forward, so much so that I become paralysed and my progress screeches to a halt. So sometimes I do find myself writing the obvious thing, especially when it came to getting enough words onto the page to beat the NaNoWriMo challenge. I knew I needed to get from point A to point C, and going via point B seemed like the best way to do it. As with everything else, you can always go back and replace point B with something completely different later on. Similarly, if you have too many choices, then you can become crippled by indecision. Is it better to do a scene this way or that? Do I send my characters on a pointless side quest to Canto Bight, or actually let them have a meaningful impact on the story? Do they brave the weather in the snowy mountain pass or get lost in labyrinthine mines below the mountain? You can sit there agonising about it and never actually write a single word. Sometimes you just have to pick a path so that you can continue your journey, even if it means not knowing exactly where it will take you. The alternative, of course, is to write both options and then see which one works better when they're on the page. But you don't want to get distracted creating a whole multiverse within your story if creating all of these branches stops you from getting to the end. It's much better to write something and discover that it doesn't work than to spend ages trying to somehow work out which of your 3 ideas for the next scene in your story is best. This is where your experience may vary, of course. You may be more of a planner than me and know exactly where you want each stage of your story to go. You might want to plan ahead, working out every meticulous detail, or make a spreadsheet to evaluate the pros and cons of each idea before proceeding, and that's fine too. It just doesn't work for me, as I just end up getting stuck. And that, I think, is a key part of this advice. Get to know your own strengths and weaknesses, learn to use them to your advantage or find ways around them. And for me, taking on the NaNoWriMo challenge was a really good way to learn those things. Lesson number 3, don't be precious. Another reason why you shouldn't spend too much time rewriting and polishing things before you finish the first draft is that you don't want to end up being precious about stuff that you probably ought to cut. I must have rewritten the first act of the sci-fi novel, which I've been working on for over a decade now, dozens of times, but I've only partially written Act 2 and have only sporadic notes in the occasional scene from Act 3. I wanted the opening to be perfect, but how can the opening be perfect if I don't know what the ending is? I have wasted so much time adding stuff or trying to polish stuff that just doesn't work rather than focusing on actually writing the story. Not only that, but even if you have written something great, it might not actually fit in with the themes of your story or the journey that your hero is taking. In my story, The Journey, which is an allegory for my struggles with mental health, I wrote a scene where the main character was harassed by a swarm of annoying insect-like creatures that was supposed to be a metaphor for anxiety. However, I just didn't have enough room to fit it in because of the word limit, plus it was a distraction from the main plot of the story. So even though I was very pleased with how it turned out, I had to cut the whole scene. This doesn't necessarily mean that it was wasted effort. You will always learn something from writing, even if it does end up on the cutting room floor. But you should be prepared to write, knowing that you are probably going to have to rewrite large chunks of it and or throw some of it away. This will not only stop you obsessing over individual scenes within your story and allow you to get to the end of the story more easily, but it will also allow you to take more risks and maybe discover things that weren't part of the plan but make your story even better. In summary then, I would say that I did learn something from the NaNoWriMo challenge. I have a number of tips that I've used to help finish other novel drafts, as well as for writing short stories, blog posts and even the script for this video. These 3 big tips are: don't get distracted, just pick something, and don't be precious. Again, not all of these will work for you, but hopefully by talking about what worked for me, it can give you an idea of the obstacles that you may face and how to find ways around them. So that's my tips, but what about you? What distractions have tripped you up in the past? Do you have any advice for getting to the end of the first draft? How do you avoid getting distracted when naming a character, or choose which way to proceed with your story? Let me know in the comments. This concludes my 2-parter about my experience of NaNoWriMo and the lessons I learned from taking part. But I do have some more writing videos planned. Subscribe to hear my thoughts about Scrivener, the writing software that I use to write my novels, as well as my review of Neil Gaiman's masterclass, and my thoughts on some other pieces of writing advice. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.